a short summary of the history of the EU. That's what I'm going to bring you today in this video. So let's just get started. Welcome back to my channel and welcome back to another episode of EU Explained. Today I want to bring you a very quick summary of the history of the EU. And I'll just go through some decades, but I won't make it too long for you, but I just want to give you an overview. First of all, in the beginning, there were a few real pioneers working on this, and I won't mention them all. It's quite a long list, but after the Second World War, it was quite remarkable that the German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer and French President Charles de Gaulle have been quite close. That they developed quite a friendship, which really helped developing to the point where the EU we have today found a real start, and the 70 years of peace we have now found its start there. So I really wanted to mention that before I get into the decades with my small overview. In the time from 1945, the end of the war, until 1959, peace started to develop, even right after the founding of the democratic Germany, for example. Since 1950, the European Coal and Steel Community was the big start of the unification of European economies and the start of the peaceful times after the war. As I gave you an overview of the member states, the 6 founding members were Belgium, Germany, France, Italy, Luxembourg and the Netherlands, and that was already quite remarkable because the Cold War already started, and so it was a nice balance against that, with having these countries which were at war not even 10 years ago to begin the peace process like this in a really good cooperation. And the Treaty of Rome in 1957 then created the European Economic Community, the EEC, what mostly is called the Common Market. In the 60s, it was a time of economic growth. There were good conditions for economy. One factor was that the EU member states, what I call them to make it easier all the time, abolished tariffs on trade between the member states. That will be talked about now as the customs union found its beginning there. And the organization of agricultural production also was more organized between the states, so everybody could have sufficient food. And in that time it even started what we were discussing, especially in the 80s and 90s, with the surplus of food. You know, we have a say in Germany at that time, the Bottom Mountains and stuff like that. In the 70s, that was the first time the European Union got bigger. The first enlargement in 1973, if you remember from the other video, was Denmark, Ireland and the United Kingdom. And in the end of that decade, finally democracy started to get a bigger role in the European Union, because in 1979 all citizens could directly vote for their members of parliament. And also in 1979, what is I guess more important today than they could imagine that time, if you had the climate demonstrations on Friday, was that the EU adopted regulations for environmental protection in 1979 as well. And for the big chemical companies and stuff like this, they invented the polluter pays principle. The 80s obviously were in for a big change in Europe. In the end of that decade, the Berlin Wall fell, and Germany was Germany had its reunification. But before that, in the 1980s, several more countries joined the EU. There was Greece in the beginning, Spain and Portugal were to follow, and in 1986 the Single European Act is signed, and that laid a foundation for a 6-year 6-year program to tackle the problems of free cross-border trade within the EU. And that was the beginning of the single market. In the 90s, of course, there were a lot of changes again. First of all, in 93, I guess it was, the single market was completed, which started in the 80s. And parts of the single market is the free movement of 4 things: of goods, services, capital, and people. Don't mix it up with the free movement to work. It's just free movement between the member states of the single market. And there were 2 more contracts to deepen the EU. There was the Maastricht Treaty and the Treaty of Amsterdam. That included environmental regulations, but that included cooperation in security and defense as well. In the 90s, there were more members joining the EU. Then it was, for once, Austria in 95, and Finland and Sweden. And the 90s were the decade of the beginning of the Schengen treatments, which allows members, the people of the member states of the Schengen treaties to cross the borders without checks. In the first decade of this millennium, there was a further expansion. As I stated in my member list video, because they needed time after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Now the former Eastern Bloc states that wanted to join the EU and were ready to join the EU then started the EU. And in the time between 2000 and 2009, the EU started to strengthen their cooperation against crime. Many states joined in this time, but I won't list them here again because I did this in another video. But in 2009, the Treaty of Lisbon was signed by all EU member states. It just gives the institutions of the EU a better way of working, and it's just more practical. From 2010 on until today, there were new challenges. I mean, in the decade before, we also had September 11 and everything that the global impact of that. But from after 2010, we had a global economic crisis. You know, the banking crisis as well that happened. The European Union, in the meantime, got the Peace Nobel Prize. As a last country, Croatia joined the EU. And of course, another problem, since 2014 in the election, they're getting more and more Eurosceptic parties into the European Parliament. And to summarize that, there are many more security issues the European Union has to deal with nowadays that she hadn't in her past before. And their foreign policy always got more important, like the Crimean assimilation by the Russians, like Syria, like Libya. There was a lot going on, and the EU has to have an eye on all these things as well, because only as the EU at whole, they will have an impact in the future on global politics like that. And as well, the biggest hit to the EU was in 1916 with a referendum on an island, the Brexit referendum in the UK. And since then, the EU is dealing with Brexit. I hope I did it short enough. I didn't want to overstretch your will to listen to history. So I hope I could get it short enough. But I thought it was important to bring a short summary of the history to show why the EU is there where it is today. And of course, they have to work on a lot. Some of these treaties I named are one of the problems we have today, because they were not what they should have been, and they didn't make the work as easy as it should have. And it didn't strictly separate some organizational divides between the member states and the EU. If you ask me, there should be a proper list. That's the task of the EU, that's the task of a member state, and they don't get involved into each other. But that's something for the future. We are in a history video today, so let's skip that for now. I thank you for watching. If you haven't done so yet, please subscribe to my channel. For now, I want to say thank you for watching again. Have a nice day and see you soon.